So what did you take from what the speaker had to say there then? Yes, he was talking about national differences, but they can have an impact on the workplace, and can be taken into that workplace context. Makes you think about why we do things, maybe why people react like they do to things, and it may have explained some experience you've had with somebody or something in the workplace and how it's turned out. I once coached a foreign care manager who came to me in one session and was talking about how he was always annoyed and battling with his staff. And when we discussed it, one of the main things that came out was he said they didn't respect him. After sort of going through that, he was talking about the fact that when he spoke to them, they were looking him in the eye. He said, in my country, you don't eyeball your boss when he's talking to you. You look down out of respect. I had to explain to him that, we train or teach people or encourage people to look people in the eye when they're communicating with them, to show that they're actively listening and that they're involved. And I suppose that was a cultural difference. He came back to me after a while and said he was still finding it really strange, but it had changed the way he thought about what his staff were doing. So there's a cultural difference and how it impacted in the workplace. He also talked about the way that people might deal with those changes, the way they might react. And I've categorized those as the 3 C's. He talked about people confronting, complaining, or conforming to what's going on. In confronting, it's often seen as resistance and seen as a bad thing, but that's not always the case. If people are challenging the situation or asking questions, at least they've recognized that something's going to have an impact. As long as those challenges or those questions are in a positive way, constructive way, then they can be seen as a good thing. And in an open culture where people are encouraged to communicate, where they feel they've got the open channels, and they feel they're involved, that can be a positive thing. However, in a power-based culture where everything is done from a central point and one person holds all the power, those challenges or those questions can be seen as a negative effect. Complaining is probably the most sort of negative point in that, and that's where people are offended by something, they feel disgruntled by the way they've been treated, and that's normally down to poor communication, poor involvement, and does lead to a negative situation, so really needs to be avoided by communicating. And finally, conforming, usually seen as a positive, but if it's subversive conforming, in other words, underneath they're not really completely happy with it, they're just doing it because they feel they have to, or they have to, then underneath they may be trying to stir things up or subversively do things the other way. And accepting is really the positive outcome. When people have accepted the change, they feel that it's going to bring positivity, that they're fully involved in it, they're fully engaged with it, and therefore they take it on board and accept that the change is a positive outcome. So 3 ways people can react that we need to consider. Not always a negative when people are confronting things. Complaining means we probably haven't communicated properly, and if they're conforming, how are they conforming? Are they really buying into it, or are they just doing it just to get through? So let's start to wrap up now, and let's look at recapping on what we've covered in this session. So let's start thinking about summing up. All leaders have a role of recognising, acknowledging, supporting and developing staff so that things work for the organisation and the team, and that we get the best out of the staff for the business and for the benefit of the team members. The culture of that is massively important, and we may need to support that or develop it using coaching, as we talked about in session 1, changing our leadership style, as we talked about in session 1, and understanding and communicating, managing expectation, as we talked about when we were talking about managing virtual remote teams. We'll talk more about the intricacies of how we communicate in Unit 503, but all of these areas impact on the culture, and we need to consider the culture we're working, because we've talked all the way through about adapting or adjusting to lead our team, and we've talked about how that effective leadership is about inspiring, motivating and empowering people, and if the culture is not right, that's not going to happen. As we've said, if we take a power culture with one person or a select few who've got the power, and then we try encouraging self-managing teams, or we have staff that are used to being self-managing teams, then it's going to clash. And then they may either confront or conform to that. They may conform subversively and carry on in the background. But we need to try and support them and motivate them through that change, and ensure they stay engaged if we want to be successful. We've talked about values and factors and how they're embedded into culture, and it will probably revolve around things like openness and honesty, and you would hope that and staff involvement and participation and clear communication are in that culture, but it's not always the case. Objectives for this session were to describe the cultures that exist in organisations, and I think we've added to that when we looked at culture types in session 1, but I think we've added flesh onto the bones there. The second was to analyse internal and external factors which affect the organisation's culture. Again, I think we covered that in session 1 with what they were, and I think we've added to that in this session. Then we had to explain the effects of organisational culture could have on an individual and teams. Well, I think we've talked about the challenges that we got there and highlighted the relationship between how different people have different cultural influences and how we've got to make sure that we're taking that into account. And we've talked about mixing skills. And then the final one was to analyse relationships between culture and change in the workplace. And we've looked at the relationship between culture and change, and right at the end there we were talking about how people might react differently to changes in what they expect or what they're used to. So on the next slide we'll just start looking at the final assignment for this session. And to finish off this session, and before you move on to session 4, there's an activity, a Word document, activity 5, and it's really about reflecting on what your company's values are and if they're stated. If not, you need to think about what you think possibly they are, or your values in your team are. And there's a table you can complete, and next to when you've listed them you can talk about the actions that are shown internally and externally that meet that value, such as internal will be for staff and externally will be for customers or for stakeholders, external stakeholders. And then it talks about what your impact is as the leader. How do you get involved in making sure that value is reflected in your actions and behaviours? Again, like I say, look at your company. If there isn't any, try and think what you think they are. What I mean by that is if they're not stated anywhere, think about what you think they are and use that to reflect on. And once that's uploaded, you can then move on to session 4.